Hi, and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we examine the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke DeWolf.
Today we will be continuing our series on the Havamal. I think we're on the the next to last part of it, advice to Loddfafnir, and we'll hopefully be finishing that part off today, and then the next episode will be the end of the Havamal, and that's been quite the journey already. So
yeah, it has. This will be the 5th episode in that series, 6 in total. I mean, it's taken us a long time. It's certainly a long poem, but it's been quite the journey to kind of get to this point anyway. So
yeah, I think I'll miss it when we're done.
I agree. Definitely, there'll be a void in the Northern Myths podcast schedule for sure.
Definitely. So just a small recap on the Havamal. It's the sayings of the High One. It's basically wisdom from Odin on how to live life. And these bits of wisdom include things like don't get drunk, be a good host, be a good guest, don't seduce your neighbor's wife. Things like that should be obvious, but it's probably good to have it written down so there's no confusion as to whether or not you should be doing these things or not. You should not be. And then today we're on the third part. So it's divided up into 3 parts. Into 4 parts in total. The first part is basically hospitality, and sort of, I guess, when you talk about the sayings of the High One, that's kind of what they're thinking of when they talk about that. Second, there's Odin's love poem, and it's him getting into all sorts of mischief with the ladies, and I think mischief might be the right word for these ones. There's other stories such as the Lay of Harbord, where we get into it's less mischief and more like evil and terrible things. So yeah. And it's funny because we'll be seeing some advice that's given to Loddfafnir where he actually contradicts himself by acting in the way he's saying to Loddfafnir, "Don't act this way."
We'll point that out when it happens. It's kind of funny because that's our previous episode to this one, or 2 episodes depending on whether we decide to release an interview since this one. So
for sure. And then after this, it'll be the rune poem and how Odin acquired the runes and all that kind of stuff. So that'll be also interesting.
Something to look forward to for sure.
Absolutely.
But be sure to check out the previous episodes of the Havamal if you haven't already. This one is pretty self-contained, actually. But after you've listened to this episode, highly encourage you to give the previous episodes a look because they're very good, very complimentary. And with the exception of Odin's love poem, they kind of all fit the same theme. But that one is unique, to say the least.
Definitely. And just before we get started on Loddfafnir, we'll be using the Poetic Edda, translated by Jackson Crawford and published by Hackett Publishing, as we've been using throughout the Poetic Edda. It's a great translation. The translation itself is accurate and easy to read, which is often hard to find. And we've got links to Amazon for the book and links to Jackson Crawford's YouTube channel where he talks about the Norse language and sort of all the interesting background information you'd want to know to have a good foundation for reading the Poetic Edda. So definitely check that out. And a big thanks to them for letting us use this translation.
Yep, big thanks to them.
And so I think without further ado, we will dive into the Havamal and advice to Loddfafnir. And it's starting from stanza 111. It is time to speak on the wise man's chair at earth's well. I saw and was silent. I saw and I thought. I listened to men's speech. I heard about runes. They were not silent with counsel at Odin's hall. In Odin's hall, I heard them say so. I guess I should probably just, on to 112. I counsel you, Loddfafnir. If you'll take my advice, you'll learn. You will profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Do not rise at night unless you're spying on your enemies or seeking a place to relieve yourself. Luke, what does that mean?
Okay, there's a lot here. A lot, really. We're setting the scene, first of all. This is conceptually different from the rest of the Havamal in that they're sort of specifically setting it up as kind of a situation where this young man, Loddfafnir, is in Odin's hall and he's theoretically speaking to Odin. Odin is speaking to him more correctly. This entire poem, well, this section of the Havamal, anyway, today's episode, is going to be addressed to Loddfafnir. And so it's unique in that respect, and we're going to be using this kind of same rhythm. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, et cetera, et cetera. It's all the same for the most part each time, but so just so you're aware, that's going to get repeated quite a bit here. But what's important as far as kind of setting this up is he's talking about speaking on the wise man's chair at Urd's well. So as a recap here, because we have covered the concept of Urd's well in a couple of episodes, but if you haven't seen or listened to any of those, so the world is split up into three major sections of the world: the known, the unknown, and then the kind of the deep, undifferentiated chaos, to borrow Dan's new favorite term. And they are expressed in three wells. The water cycle is sort of a concept kind of like fate, in that the world tree, Yggdrasil, it gets water flowing through it constantly, and that is representative of fate. And they all come up through these wells. And first there's Fergalmir, which is less of a well, more of like a spring, and it's really in the chaotic part of the world, and it's kind of nasty. It's in all the evil realms like Niflheim, Niflhel. It's all near that stuff, and it's really where all the nasty things kind of could happen, sort of thing. It's chaos, so good things could come out of that as well, but that's not necessarily the case. Then there's Mimir's well, and this is out in the land of the giants, and this is the land of the unknown. And Odin's got one eye in Mimir's well in order to keep an eye on the unknown, and that's a good thing. And we get into kind of why that's important in a couple of other episodes, I believe in our Voluspa episodes. But then Urd's well, this well is in Asgard. It comes up in Asgard, which is this pinnacle world, this representation of, well, it's not wrong to consider it something like heaven. We've got Midgard here where people live, but then we've got Asgard where the gods live. And this well is where the gods live. These are the best beings. These are these examples of what it means to be the best, the most wise. And sitting at this well of fate in the realm of the gods really just means this is where all the best known wisdom is going to be available. Something like that. Symbolically, it's something like that. And so Loddfafnir is coming here to Urd's well, to the wise man's chair at Urd's well, and he is here to listen, to learn, and he is about to get quite a lot given to him.
Absolutely, that's a great introduction and a great way to start off the setting of the poem. And it's funny, we've gone through a lot of the Havamal, and a fair amount of it is about how to become wise, and it's pretty much summed up in this in the stanza where he's silent, he's thoughtful, he's listening to men's speech, he's learning about the runes, and listening to counsel in Odin's hall, and it's exactly how you're supposed to behave if you're going to be listening to someone to learn what they have to teach you, and he's following is it rule 10, where you're assuming that the person you're talking to knows more about something than you do?
9 or 10.
9 or 10.
One of them, yeah.
One of them. It's one of the 12 rules. So we've got our Jordan Peterson thing out of the way, like right quick.
Right away.
But yeah, so he's Loddfafnir is doing exactly what he should be doing to gain wisdom. And the first bit of wisdom that he gets is to get a good night's sleep, unless he's spying on his enemy or he has to go pee. And I think that's I think that's a pretty good. I don't know if it's like a great start, but it's very practical. Like, and we've actually kind of known this, and it's kind of funny. These two things are paired, but there's we've known this for a long time. A lot of tribal societies would actually drink a lot of water at night before they went to bed, so that they could get up early for early morning raids, because they'd be up. And one of the benefits is that if you've had a lot of water to drink and your body processes it, and then you wake up because you have to relieve yourself, you're actually not that groggy, because your body has had a chance to go through the proper cycle of waking up. Because it's not like being woken up by an alarm clock or whatever, where you could be deep within, REM sleep and it just messes everything up. No, your body's actually like, oh, we have to go relieve ourselves. So, wake up and be aware, and you'd actually be aware enough to skillfully spy on the enemies and be able to understand what you were actually watching when you were seeing your enemies. So yeah, it's just a funny, it's funny that they start off with that, but also funny because, they're talking about relieving yourself, and it's just like the most natural thing in the world.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, sleeping through the night is definitely positive. I think it relates back to some of the earlier parts of the Havamal where it talks about something like don't think about the things that you can't control before going to sleep, sort of thing. And I mean, that this is just saying, again, kind of like, get a good night's sleep through the night. And spying on your enemy, I mean, that's kind of, well, that implies at least you're trying to do something to stave off your enemies killing you, which is good.
Definitely. There's another stanza too that says, if you want to steal another man's land or wife, is it wife? I think so, right?
It might be wife, but we've had a lot of it. We're going to have some evidence against it being good to seduce another man's wife, ironically.
Yeah. But basically, if you want to get ahead in life, you're going to have to get up early to do it. I
say ironically because in Harbors, Odin does a lot of wife seducing, and then he's telling you to not seduce other men's wives.
Well, even in the Havamal, in the previous part of it, he's trying to seduce another man's wife, but she's wise to it, and she's like, hey, come over tonight. And then she has all of her husband and his buddies there to beat him up, and then drives him up. But then Odin goes back again, and she's tied up a ferocious dog to her bed to protect her. So, if you needed any reasons not to seduce another man's wife, just looked at the Havamal.
Odin isn't the best example on that, but he says not to do it, so it's kind of a do what I say, not what I do situation. But that's why I say ironically. I don't want that to be taken out of context. That I'm saying it's like ironic to say not to seduce another man's wife. That's just, I don't know. That's open to too much interpretation.
Definitely. Should I move on?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so this will be stanzas 113 and 114. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Do not sleep in the arms of a sorceress, or else she will lock your limbs. She will enchant you so that you won't care for advice, nor a powerful man's words. You will want neither food nor the pleasure of friends' company, and you will sleep full of sorrow.
Kind of dark, huh?
Yeah, that got dark quick.
Now, so you go from, get a good night's sleep unless you're going to go pee, all the way to don't sleep in the arms of a sorceress because she'll enchant you, and you won't want food or friends, and you'll be full of sorrow. Like, yikes. I think this is something relating a little bit to the idea that women in general, but also I'll take that even further. Love can paralyze you. It can absolutely just strike you and take hold of you. And I mean, that's all you're going to think about. In the previous section, the love poem, Odin talked about multiple times, like having like longing for a woman he couldn't have, or being with essentially what amounted to like a sorceress or a wicked woman, or however he described it exactly. And then it was like it just didn't work out for him. He didn't get anywhere. And what they're describing here, kind of like your limbs being locked, or not caring about food or friends or anything like that. I mean, that definitely sounds like early stages of a relationship, but possibly also kind of like an abusive relationship, something that hasn't maybe like kind of gotten there, but they're kind of controlling or something like that. And it's got echoes of a lot of possible things, and certainly it's got some wisdom there. The one of the messages in the previous section was that women can be deceitful, and I think first of all this is going with that, but the other point that Odin, I'm not sure he's careful to make the point, but we were careful to point it out, was that so can men. There's a whole stanza that is very clear about men are also deceitful with women. And I think the idea is kind of like both men and women kind of do these things that knot each other up, and they tie each other up symbolically in sort of the sense that they get paralyzed and can't really move. And this is all kind of speaking to the same thing. It's an echo of the previous section, Odin's love poem.
Definitely. And you're right. We made a point about this, that Odin spends a lot of time talking about the dangers of women being deceitful. And we talked a little bit about why there'd be the emphasis on that. And I think it's twofold. One is that it's good to have men prepared for, it's not that women are inherently deceitful at all, but people are deceitful. Some of them are going to be women. Some of them are going to be men. But in terms of, let's say, overreacting and being actually able to do serious damage with that, men are definitely the ones who are, with their physicality and physiology, they're able to do a lot more damage if they act out their feelings being hurt. So I definitely see why they would be warned first, so that it doesn't take them completely by surprise and they fly off the handle and end up killing someone, which still happens like fairly regularly today. That's not an uncommon thing. The other thing is that in the love poem, Odin says, women are deceitful and all this kind of stuff. He then does say men are also deceitful, and then goes on to prove like every which way they can be deceitful through his own actions. So it's actually a pretty balanced section. And one of the interesting things about this one, about not sleeping in the arms of a sorceress, well, part of the question is like who is a sorceress? And I think it would be that understood that most women have the capability of being a sorceress. The reason being is that for men, when they are around a woman, well, let's start with like their mother. Like their mother is able to, first of all, when they're growing up, their mother provides everything for them and is comfort and all that kind of stuff. And you can't overemphasize how huge that is. And then as they grow up and they start becoming more independent, and they catch the eye of the cute girl on the other side of the village, and they notice their heart starts racing and their hands start sweating and they can't speak. Well, what could that be other than a curse from a sorceress, right? Like they don't have the physiological understanding that, okay, well, their heart's beating fast, which means, blood's pumping at this rate, so they're going to sweat and all this kind of stuff. And all they can understand about it is that it's whenever this woman is around, this happens to them. Well, it's because they're attracted to them. And I think every guy who's ever been attracted to a woman, well, really, or attracted to a man, I mean, if you have that feeling of, I'm attracted to this person, you get that fluttery feeling, like it just happens. And it was considered kind of magical at the beginning, like before we kind of understood the crazy soup of hormones that's actually occurring. And so what does that mean when he's saying don't sleep in the arms of a sorceress? Well, part of it is that part of the Havamal is always keep your wits about you. And I think that's a big part of that, is make sure that you have your wits about you, even in matters of love, because you are going to be going up against hormones and chemicals and things like that you actually don't have control over. So, do your best to be aware of it, but even then it's not going to work. You're just going to maybe be able to mitigate some of the ridiculousness. And that's not to say you shouldn't give yourself over to it, because I mean, it's love and wonderful and all that kind of stuff, but just, be aware, because it's a very volatile situation. And, there's a reason why, if a wife goes missing, the first suspect is the husband. Like that's just how it is, because you're dealing with such a volatile situation, such as love and lust. And it's funny. I remember, at least on one occasion, there being a woman I was attracted to as a younger man, where I absolutely experienced all of these things. And it reminded me of, and I don't remember if I've talked about this already on the podcast, the tarantula hawk. Okay. Well, this is like perfect for it. So the tarantula hawk is this, like giant wasp or hornet, one of those stingy things. And they attack tarantulas. And it's crazy because tarantulas don't have too many predators, really, because they're big and hairy and have fangs and can generally take care of themselves. Well, for every defense mechanism that the tarantula has, the tarantula hawk has the proper adaptation to overcome it. So not only overcome it, but put the tarantula in a worse spot than they were before if they had not done their natural defensive mechanism. So, for example, one defensive mechanism that the tarantula has is to rear up on its hind legs and show off its fangs. That scares off most things that might want to, go after it. Well, the tarantula hawk is able to, because it's nimble enough, kind of like sneak in closer to it and get to its underbelly. And then what happens, and, tell me if anyone who's ever been in love with someone who might not have been the best for them can't relate to this experience. The tarantula hawk then stings the tarantula and then lays its eggs inside of the paralyzed but still alive tarantula. And then the eggs hatch and the little tarantula hawks eat their way out. And I mean, if that isn't like the perfect metaphor for what a heartbreak feels like when you've been in a situation sort of with that much craziness and hormones, I mean, what is like? So I think that's the warning here, is that just watch yourself so that you don't get tarantula hawked, like, so that you're able to, that you're always able to maintain some semblance of control over yourself, even in the midst of, a grand love affair.
Yeah, that's quite the metaphor. That's quite the image. It's not very pleasant, but yeah, neither is heartbreak, though. That's for sure. It's funny. I like the idea that it's good to warn men about this stuff, because women, girls, so I'm told, get taught all this stuff by their mothers or their sisters or whatever, because specifically of the danger of upsetting a man who takes this the wrong way, and then they learn kind of, first of all, how to deal with that, and that this sort of thing is just something that they have to be careful of and aware of. And you know what, I've been seeing articles and opinion pieces and things like that from women who are saying, you know, they don't like that this is the situation. And you know what, fair enough. That's got to be hard to have to walk on eggshells around any unknown guy that you meet, or who you know, comes up to you, propositions you, whatever, and you know, that's got to be scary. Again, more physically imposing, everything like that. That really has got to be rough. That really has got to be rough. And I can't say that this is anything that you know, my personal behavior. I would never do anything where like I would get violent or aggressive with a woman if she rejected me or anything like that, because I'm not a dirtbag human. But you know, for the situations where it does happen, like I'm really am sorry that this happens to women, and you know, I'm assuming some men, something like that. This happens to people, and that's really, really terrible. But I think it's the wrong reaction to sort of say, well, we shouldn't have to be careful anymore. It's totally fine to have that feeling, absolutely, because it is unfair for women, weaker people, whatever, to have to walk around on eggshells from people who are more physically imposing, men mostly. But the thing about it is, if it's in the furtherance of taking care of yourself, you know, being careful and getting out of the situation alive, maybe it's unpleasant, right? And I'm definitely not saying like go along with whatever this bad person is suggesting just so that you stay alive. I also mean like not get harmed at all, hurt, anything like that. You know, that's something that unfortunately I think should still kind of be used and be taught, that this is kind of something there. And I mean, the trouble about it is that I don't see this changing, because I don't think this is a societal issue necessarily. I mean, again, I'm saying like it's dirtbag humans that do stuff like this, like they get physically aggressive at women for not appreciating their kind advances, which I say with like fully laced with sarcasm, by the way, if that wasn't clear. But then the entire thing about it is that it's hormonal. It's like men have a lot of testosterone, aggressive behaviors, aggressive tendencies, and it can, well, if it's not harnessed properly, it can become something that becomes violent, and you're not going to. I don't think society has found a way to properly channel every man's every kind of whim when that happens. And you know, maybe that is something that we can get better at as a society, but I don't think the answer is, you know, stop doing things that are going to prevent the worst case scenario if there is a negative reaction like this. But certainly, you know, women are starting to call this out more. And I mean, I think society in general needs to start being like, yeah, you're a dirtbag human if you do this, and stop that.
For sure. Some sort of, well, I think they could do it more, definitely. But there definitely is, like we do kind of publicly shame a lot of these dirtbag humans, thankfully. Like, and that's like the exact proper way to treat it is, you know, public shaming and showing that this is not behavior that is tolerated. And the other part of the solution is that you're never going to be able to, I guess, properly guide and harness every man. But if you have enough men that have been properly guided, they can actually fight off the ones that can't or refuse to be. So
right. And I mean, first of all, I would I would hope percentages are very low of men who do this very, very bad behavior sort of thing. But what becomes the point where you would not take precautions against that? If it's 1 in 1,000, that's still pretty high. You probably encounter 1,000 people in a week, a month, something like that, just passing on the street. You know what I mean? And then what if it's like 1 in 10,000? Yeah, maybe it's something like that. But if you drop your guard completely, and if it's only 1 in 10,000, like that's still a pretty high chance of something bad happening. 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, maybe at 1 in a million. Maybe that starts to be like, okay, that's very, very rare now. And I hope we get there where it's like only 1 in a million men is not properly channeled into good behavior and good activities and things like that to avoid having this happen.
And even with that, like right now, it's a fairly small minority of men who engage in dirtbag behavior, which I actually like this term. It kind of gets the point across nicely. However, so there's a small percentage of men that do it, but they do it like repeatedly. It's not just a one-off, and that's where you get like the volume, and it's just a few guys kind of ruining it. But yeah, and it makes me think of there's a quote from Margaret Atwood, who said, men worry that they're going to get turned down by a woman, and women worry that they're going to get killed by the man. And it's like, yeah, that is unfortunately the sort of physiological setup of that. So
yeah, and you know what, like fair enough for being like, for not liking that situation, for the women who are saying that this isn't fair, that this isn't the right situation. Yeah, it's not fair. Like, unfortunately, biology is not fair. Like,
yeah,
men have vastly more upper body strength and taller, more physically imposing, whatever. It's
and testosterone. I mean, that's the big one of the big sort of differences that. One of the big differences that makes a big difference too.
Yeah. And so it's, but fair enough though. Like really I almost forget where we started with this. It was, this is certainly a garden path though, but no, for real, it's like fair enough to any women who don't think this is the right way it should be. And realistically, it's like, these guys who are making life hard for you are dirtbags. So let's just keep saying that,
Yeah.
But pulling it back in a little bit, this is like one of the things that can happen when you fall in love or put yourself out there, and I think that's what it was. It was like men are taught these. It's good that men get taught these things, like be careful of like what can happen to you if you fall in love, sort of deal, or fall in lust or attraction, as the case may be, and maybe then they get some idea of what could happen and are a little better prepared for it. And maybe that also is another part of a solution here as well, where it's like, teaching young men how to properly interact with young women or just, young people, whatever you're into, right? That's also an aspect that probably a lot of parents could do better at, right? So
we actually have a stanza coming up in a little bit about that very thing, how to interact. So,
well,
and it is actually like good advice. So, I guess move on a bit.
I think so.
Stanza 15, back to the poem. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never seduce another man's woman with whispers in her ear.
So again, we were talking about how it was ironic that Odin would say anything like this, because we've discussed multiple incidences of him specifically, and like the exact words are used, seducing another man's woman. And that's like, if it's anything, it's like, do what I say, not what I do, sort of thing. And of course, the wisdom is valid. And there are a lot of reasons why the wisdom is valid. But first of all, just to get it out of the way, Odin is being very hypocritical because he does it a lot. And his rationalizations for doing that seem to be he gets some kind of benefit out of seducing the other man's wife, such as a good time, possibly, but usually not just that. Anyway, so why this wisdom is important, the way I see it, is that it really talks about the underpinnings of social order, which is, first of all, one, the idea of monogamy in general, for the most part, is the underpinning of societies in the West, in Europe. There are certainly a lot of societies that aren't monogamous, and of course the Norse, I believe they had situations like concubines and, exceptions for, I suppose you would say the most powerful would have, unique circumstances sort of thing. But for the most part, monogamy was like kind of one of those big underpinnings as far as, people being married. And the other part about it is that, the oaths that bind a society together, and marriage is one of them. The oaths of marriage is one of the major things that ties society together. And violating that, I think they're sort of putting the onus here actually on the man who is seducing the married woman. Like, it's wrong to transgress that from the outside, to try to tempt someone to transgress that. And I think that's the right attitude. I mean, the people who are married have already made those oaths. So if they step outside the bounds of marriage, they're already breaking a societal oath. But this is also sort of saying, like, if you're even trying to seduce someone to do that is also a social transgression. And I mean, I think you could definitely, I think you should definitely extend this to, the other side of it, like seducing any married person, right? And it just emphasizes that monogamy is important in the society as a method of ordering society in a way that's going to result in the most married people in general. It's not going to end up, the most powerful man gets all the women, and some men get like one wife, and a lot of men don't end up married at all. And those are the ones that get very frustrated, and frustrated can turn into a lot worse than frustrated.
Oh, absolutely. And it, in terms of infidelity, it's, again, if there's if a wife gets murdered, they look at the husband first, and like, was there infidelity? Because they go together. That it's a very strong reaction to that a man will have to infidelity. And I really like what you're saying about the person who's trying to seduce the wife. He's kind of directly assaulting the foundations of society. And if you were to seriously damage that institution of marriage, like, that causes a great deal of instability within the society. And you're actually starting right at the bottom, because it would affect the children first, and then as they grow up, they bring that instability with them, and then it's and then pass it on to their children or their offspring. So what this stanza really is showing is, protect the foundational institutions that you have in your society, because without them, things fall apart, and you fall apart in a violent way. And you can see how important this particular thing is, because you find it, you find it in the Ten Commandments. So, and you find it in other cultures. Like, it's a rule, that we've discovered that, hey, if you're going to be married, don't let other people into that, because it's harmful. And in fact, I know in Judaism, it's one of the the big three things you can't do. There's like, you can't blaspheme. So, for example, if someone says, if you don't steal this loaf of bread, I'll kill you. Well, in Jewish law, then you are then allowed to steal the loaf of bread because the stealing versus murder isn't comparable. Murder is way worse. So, but they've got three things that are that are beyond the pale that you can never commit under any circumstance. So, murder, sexual immorality, which would be taking another man's wife, and blasphemy. So if they were to pit, say if you don't have sex with this man's wife, I'm going to kill you. Well, you're going to have to die then, because it's better for you to die than for you to commit that sin. And we're seeing something similar here, where it's being laid out very clearly that this is one of the worst things that you can do in a society. So yeah,
exactly. It's a good little stanza here, and I mean, I don't want it to make it seem like it's only on the onus of the one person kind of from the outside. I mean, it's both, but this advice is for this young man sort of thing, presumably unmarried, something like that, where it's like, don't try and seduce another man's wife. It'll probably go badly for you. That's good advice. It will probably go badly for you, because those situations just, even if you're not looking at the societal implications, that's probably not going to go well for you. So either way, I like this one.
For sure. Shall I move on?
Sounds good.
Okay. Stanza 116. Back to the book. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. If you spend time wandering by land or by sea, bring plentiful provisions.
So this one is pretty darn straightforward, honestly. And I mean, okay, so you're traveling, bring food to eat. I really wish this was deeper, but realistically, there's not a lot there. This is very good advice. Bring enough to eat if you're traveling. I don't have much more than that. That's very good advice.
It is very good advice. No, it's very good, very practical, very straightforward. The scouts have it, be prepared. Yeah, that's. I don't think much more has to be said about that.
No, and the funny thing is that if something sounds obvious or something like that, that doesn't mean don't write it down in this little book of wisdom sort of thing. Because maybe it won't be obvious to someone. You know what I mean? To do that. So getting told, bring enough to eat if you're traveling. Yeah.
No, yeah.
But there's not much more to it than that, I don't think. So
no. So I'll move on. Stanza 117, back to the poem. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never let a bad man know of your misfortune, for you will never profit at all for telling him about it.
So this one's interesting. The distinction between a bad man and, a good man being kind of the opposite of that. That's important here. That's very important here, because letting a bad man know of your misfortune. So I think that's something like complaining would be the really light way of putting it, but more telling someone about your problems. And, a bad person, first of all, I think you would have to know that this person is not your friend necessarily, because a friend is it's perfectly fine to tell them about your issues, your troubles, because if you surround yourself with people who want the best for you, they'll want to hear about your problems, listen to you, maybe give advice if that's what you want, something like that. But a bad person, a bad man, I think something here is that, they might try and profit from your misfortune. Another instance from Harvard's actually was that Odin uses this magic wand that he's given by this giant ever get the name? And then Odin turns right around and enchants his wits away with it. And I mean, I guess the idea here is if you put yourself out there to someone you don't know who could be, and I think maybe that's the right way of looking at this. Like, if someone you don't know to be a good person, it's pessimistic, but the assumption should at least be that they might have negative intentions, something like that. And then they might try and profit from your misfortune, and they might take the information you give them and exploit it, or maybe you'll be more vulnerable or something like that, and it could go badly. And the emphasis on could. That's not to say every person you don't know is necessarily going to be out to do this, but it's the same vein. Don't take a chance, right?
Oh, for sure. And I think it's just bad form to always be talking about your problems to anyone and everyone who listen, because most people don't care. But it's also just stupid because, yeah, there are people out there who will take advantage of that. They'll store that away, and then, if the time ever comes that they need to use it, they're going to have it right there, and they'll be able to say the exact right thing to get you to fall apart, or they'll be able to see your vulnerabilities, and it's just sort of tactically stupid to display your weaknesses to everyone. So I definitely understand why this would be in here, that it's just not a good idea to do.
Definitely. And I mean, I don't have a lot much more to it than that, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And it speaks to kind of the cautiousness, I think, ironically, that Odin seems to preach, because, I mean, he seems to get himself into chaos a lot intentionally, but he still kind of says caution and hold back and listen and observe, right? And I mean, that's all very, very good advice, and I mean, probably helps Odin out a lot in his forays into chaos, even though he ends up in some sticky situations.
For sure. Shall we move on?
Yep.
All right. Stanza 118. Back to the poem. I saw a bad woman's words bite a man in the neck. A lying tongue was his death, and not even with good cause.
So this one is, again, interesting. And I'm perfectly happy to extend this to people in general, because I think something to remember here is that I think the Havamal in general is from, a wise man's perspective, and in general he's going to be looking at it as, women are the ones often who are doing some things to men, but then there's also kind of the realization that it happens both ways. And I mean, I think this is just a case of like negative accusations to people, false accusations to people can end up sinking the accused, even if they did nothing wrong. And I mean, it's certainly something that that can be delicate, hard to navigate, because certainly we want people to report cases of crime like assault, sexual assault, rape, anything like that. But false accusations do happen, and often the accused never recovers. There's a sort of a mob justice sort of thing. And I mean, we've got a lot of that going on in this era, the Me Too era, when, you get a lot of inappropriate behavior rightly being called out. But then you get cases like, specifically one that I know of, and of course some people might disagree with me on this, the substance of this example, but Aziz Ansari got accused by a woman of essentially not taking her nonverbal cues and not backing off quickly enough, accused of being pushy essentially, and some people kind of roasted him on social media for that. When they kind of dug into it a little bit more, it wasn't quite so like it had been described, but it was able to kind of get out there, and there was some kind of mob justice isn't the right word, because I think in that situation, for the most part, people have come to the conclusion that, there wasn't really much that could have been kind of done in that situation. When there was a clear no, there was a clear no, but it's just one of those things. And I mean, it's a tough thing to navigate in this part of society where we are now, where we're dealing with a lot of women coming to terms with a lot of inappropriate behavior. And again, I mean, like the guys who are doing this, like actually like being aggressive and workplace harassment and things like that, that's not good behavior. That's dirtbag behavior. That should stop. That should not happen. The fear I have and what I see in this stanza is something like there are going to be accusations made of things that didn't have any malicious intent, or even behaviors that, if the person doing it had any idea that it was making someone uncomfortable, they would stop, like reasonable people. So it's just something that kind of speaks to that. And it's interesting to me that even way back then, they would have had some idea of something like this being possible.
For sure. It's interesting because we see it sort of commonly but uncommonly. So what I'm thinking of sort of on a lesser spectrum, so that it's not, I guess, not as charged, but like if you go to a bar, it is not uncommon to see a woman say something to another man to get her like her boyfriend into a fight. Now, the funny thing about that is, if you go out and witness that, you're thinking, man, that was so crazy. Isn't that just like women like to get their boyfriend into a fight? When really it was just one woman out of the, few hundred women that were there that night, kind of thing. But it's like the big story of the night. And it's kind of like that with like false accusations, like sexual assault, for example. So studies done in the UK and America show that of all the sort of the claims of rape, there's probably only about 2 to 6% that would be considered false. And when there are people who are coming forward and they're lying about it, it gets a lot of press because holy crap, like it happens so irregularly that this is actually the news story. It's the proverbial man biting the dog rather than the other way around. So and I can rhyme off a few stories where it's like, yeah, this was a false charge. And so I know that I think it was the Duke lacrosse team. They were accused of raping someone. Actually, I think they were accused of raping a stripper at like a party, which this is actually pretty like pretty appropriate here then. So it never happened. It was found to have never happened. And unfortunately, the players on the team, I mean, they were put through the ringer because everyone thought, of course, they're athletes. This is what they do. So, but then it was found, nothing like that had happened. But there's a few things to take away from it. Is like, one, that was just one instance and made a huge news. So we were being inundated. And that's the thing about media, is that they take an interesting story and they'll play it to death. Two, they put themselves in a situation that was dangerous, at least, to be taken advantage of. Not that all strippers are people of low moral character or anything, but they did put themselves in a situation where it would not be hard to be taken advantage of, and the situation was taken advantage of. So if they had been... You
mean the team put themselves in a position?
The team, absolutely, yeah. And if they'd been paying a little more attention, or if they'd, read Loddfafnir, they would have realized, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea, because there are people out there that will take advantage of you when you're in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, and vulnerable in this case, sort of like probably drunk and in a situation where a false accusation could happen. Yeah,
exactly. But then, in most other cases, though, the accusation is probably, if it's not legally true, there was probably some, like, you can be a dirtbag but not be and not do illegal things and still be a dirtbag. Like, that's definitely possible. So there's that, and then just sort of the legal definition of, like, what makes a true accusation or a legally true accusation. And that's where I think, with the Me Too movement and the idea that, we should believe everyone who comes forward, it's like we should believe them to the point where we absolutely investigate it because it's worthwhile investigating it. It is, if someone comes forward, chances are they're telling the truth, at least to a point where it's worthy of investigation. If it doesn't pass the legal threshold, that's an argument about the legal system, not even necessarily about what's just, but just, does this fall under the legal system? And with our legal system, we have the presumption of innocence, so there has to be that proper investigation. And this is my personal thing, I think if the investigation does go through and it, someone's been found guilty of, sexual misconduct or rape or anything like that, for some reason we let them get off with just the wimpiest sentences. Like, I would, like, jack that up a fair amount for obvious reasons. Like, no one wants a rapist walking around after, like, 6 months in jail because the trial took a certain amount of time, and that counts for, like, 2 times the amount of time served and all this kind of garbage. Like, let them have it. Like, they absolutely deserve it. But
yeah, there should be a punishment for that. And I mean, certainly there's some people out there today that say that the criminal justice system is already too onerous for certain kinds of criminal, like sentences are too high. But no, I think in these cases where it's rape, and I mean, in this case, this is disproportionately, men are doing this to women. Men are assaulting women, and it's men who are getting light sentences in this situation. And I mean, I'll also be clear, men get the vast majority of prison sentences in general, but that's also because men are committing the most crimes. Men are inherently more violent. It's certainly not a situation where men are getting off easy for committing crime, and they also do most of it, and they also, like, populate most of the jails. But
for a reason. And testosterone really is the culprit there.
Yeah.
And fatherlessness.
Yes, that is, we've talked about that a little bit there. But the thing about this one is that, very much obviously we should jack the sentences up for this because it should be something that we deter. And I mean, there's an argument to be made of, should we have kind of deterrent or rehabilitative? Yeah, I think that's a word.
Yeah.
Criminal justice system. And okay, sure, if we're going for rehabilitation and things like that, yeah, that's the compassionate thing. And, like, let's explore that, and let's explore that as a society. But the other thing there too is in the case of fairness, where it's like, if a man rapes a woman, that man should be put in jail for a substantial amount of time and have to suffer some consequences, some serious consequences, because you know what, that woman's life has changed forever, and there should be sufficient punishment for that. I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. And it's, when you look at legal cases, it's never, like, in the matter of a rape, let's say, it's never, Mrs. whoever versus the rapist. It's the United States of America versus, dirtbag Joe or whatever, or, in countries with the Commonwealth, it's Her Royal Majesty versus dirtbag Joe. And the reason why is that it's saying society does not tolerate this, and the crime was committed against society, which I believe that. I think it's harmful to society as a whole. And so as a society, we have to punish it. All this to say, going back to this thing, is that women, just like men, can be deceitful. And so just be careful about what you're doing, and keep who you spend your time with, maintain a high standard of it.
Right. And I mean, maybe a different way of recapping it is like the false accusations can happen if you're in the wrong set of circumstances. And so try to avoid it. And I don't want this to come off as victim blaming of a different kind, which would be victim blaming of victims of false accusations. No, it's have the common sense to avoid these situations in the first place, and at least reduce the chance. It's still the person committing the crime. Absolutely. It still should be that person not committing the crime. Like, that person is a terrible person, and at the very minimum needs to be punished, right? But if you can do anything at all to minimize the chance of being victimized, like, at least try to do that. I do not believe that's victim blaming to suggest that in the future going forward, people who have the chance of being in these same situations and getting victimized should maybe try to avoid it. Certainly for the person who is already a victim of anything, whether it's a false accusation or of a rape or of an assault or anything like that, that person obviously has already had that situation happen to them, and they can't do anything about that because time does not go backwards. But for the future, for other people who are looking at this happening, they can look at that and say, maybe I will not do that. But with the full understanding that it's the terrible person committing the crime that's actually at fault there. So regardless.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always a person committing the crime whose fault it is, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all that is to say is it's a thorny one, but it's valid. And I got sidetracked again. You said false accusations do happen, but it's this astronomically low amount sort of thing. So I mean, most of the time when women speak up about something happening, usually it's true, and we should be encouraging that for people to come speak out and all that. And if they're unfortunately when the media kind of gets going on these things, the argument about possibly not reporting these cases of false accusations, or that it actually discourages women from speaking up about this stuff. And I mean, that can be tough, right? Like, if you have in your head the idea that maybe you don't get listened to, people might think it's a false accusation. We just need to do better as a society of making it clear that no, we're going to explore this to the fullest extent, but it also needs to be clear that it's serious if you falsely accuse someone of something that would rightly ruin their life if they were found guilty of committing a rape. And the mob justice that takes over before the criminal justice system has a chance to do its thing can get someone fired, lose their livelihood. Maybe they're permanently blacklisted for years and years and years, even though it's proven that they never did anything. And that should also be serious. These crimes are all serious. It's bad things to do.
Absolutely. Well, we've probably pissed off everyone equally. I hope anyway. Like,
I sure darn well hope so.
So
that's enough of that one.
Yeah, that's enough of that one. Because I think if we go any longer, then it'll be terrible. All right. Stanza 119. Back to the poem. I counsel you, Loddfafnir. If you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. If you have a friend and you trust him, go and visit him often. Weeds and high grass will grow on a path that nobody travels.
So this is refreshingly wholesome. I think this is an echo of specifically an earlier stanza, stanza 34, which said something like, it's a long and crooked walk to a bad friend, even if it's very close, but it's an easy road to a good one, no matter how far away they are. And it's the same idea. It's like, it's worth getting together with a good friend. It's worth spending time with them, fostering that friendship. Our second episode on the Havamal, which was, I think, episode 6. It might have been 6. That one had a lot of good stuff about friendship, and this is kind of an echo of that whole episode, really. Not the entire thing, but the sections on friendship, the big sections on friendship. And I like that this is kind of a different connotation, because it's emphasizing that the path will decay, like weeds and high grass, if nobody travels on it. It definitely speaks to, like, friendship takes work. It's not like you can be a good friend, but if you never see them and no one ever makes an effort, like, that's not going to keep up. You gotta work at it. And I mean, I know I've been guilty in my time of kind of letting friendships lapse, and at a certain point it's very, very hard to strike that up again, other than just kind of passing acquaintance sort of thing. If it's gone, it can be gone. But and equally, if you're away from someone because you moved away or something like that, but you still make an effort to talk, that's different. But this is still like, you got to keep up your good friendships. You have a friend and you trust him. Yeah, that's a good friendship. You want to keep that up.
Absolutely. It goes for really any important relationship. I mean, you could just as easily say this about, like, a spouse, like making sure that you're doing the things that are required to keep the marriage happy and all that kind of stuff. So it's good advice. And there's actually a fair amount of stuff about friendship in this particular part of the Havamal. So that's we'll see that later. And no, it's just good advice. Maintain your friendships, because it's important. Friends are important, and I know they're even a sort of a sign of, like, a healthy life. Like, if you've got friends, that's really good, because if you don't, like, it's not so much that you could get depressed; it's you will get depressed, and it's harder to get yourself out of it if you don't have friends to not even rely on, but just, like, be with. So,
yeah, exactly. It's just good advice in this case. Keep up with your friends as much as possible. It's good stuff.
Shall I move on? Stanza 120. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Get a good man to teach you the runes, and learn a healing spell while you live.
I almost feel like this one is like a spoiler to the very last section of the Havamal. We got to 120 stanzas and no mention of the runes yet, really. But so we really have to do a minor overview here of what I personally see the runes as actually being. And if you're not aware, the runes, well, in modern culture and popular culture, whatever, the runes are seen as some kind of sort of an alphabet, and it's certainly translatable for the most part. It was a writing system that you could translate into, the different letters and sounds that they could make in Old Norse. A couple of different versions of the runes. Most popular are that there's the Elder Futhark, which had 24 letters. And then there was the Younger Futhark, which had, I believe, 16 letters, and that one would have been used for Old Norse. The Elder Futhark would have been applicable to more like Proto-Germanic or Proto-Norse, and would have fallen out of use by the time of, the Viking era. Let's just say that. I think it's 16. It might be 18, 16, 18. There's also an Anglo-Saxon version with a couple of different sounds and things like that. But it's pretty common to the entire Germanic world. And the idea here is that it was a writing system. It was a way to to write things down. And first of all, that's good. Get a good man to teach you the runes. But I don't think that is the connotation here, because the runes were also associated with specific symbols. And in some ways, it was kind of like you had a symbol that kind of matched the sound, like the symbol for kind of an F that was like Fehu was its name, and that was kind of a symbol of wealth. And that's an oversimplification. It's actually kind of cattle was what that was, and cattle as a symbol of wealth. But anyway, the symbols had kind of a pretty deep meaning kind of on their own, and they often stood for kind of these spells. And I'm wanting to tie this all together a little bit here. I think the runes properly aren't just a writing system. It's a concept of secrets and magic and uncommon knowledge, because they weren't they were certainly something that wasn't in existence at one point, and then eventually the Norse peoples got the use of the runes. And the way they're talked about, it's like they're closely guarded secrets. And I think it really is something like, especially when you're talking about a spell, like a healing spell, it's something like the advancements that they didn't understand fully. It's something like things that they understood to be important, or things that they started learning how to do, but they didn't understand in a scientific sense like we know now, even though I would make the distinction that back then they wouldn't have understood anything scientifically because the scientific method didn't exist yet. They might have understood some things pretty darn clearly, like this method of woodworking, like they knew that, something like that. This method of making a weapon, they knew that. But maybe some things like healing, like through herbs or something like that, maybe they didn't know that, or they make a spell or something like that. To me, that sort of says something like first aid, learn first aid. But getting someone, a good man, to teach you the runes, I think that says learn deep secrets and uncommon knowledge, because things like that are what's going to set you apart from the people that don't know it. That's a connotation that I think makes sense. Learn things that will set you apart from the people that don't know those things.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and I think there's an important part about getting a good man to teach it to you. It shows the importance of mentorship, and there is a real importance of mentorship. I can't actually speak to to a woman's experience on mentorship, but I know for men, it's one of the main ways that you get to direct sort of the manly, spirited, violent temperament of a man, because you have that sort of hands-on molding of it by the mentor. And like all of the I don't know, successful people that you see, generally they've all had mentors at some point in their life, someone who took a personal interest in them and their development to be able to succeed in life and teach them the secrets of how to get by. And so I think the example of the runes here are exactly right. And just one thing I'd like to add about the runes is that they're kind of like I kind of think of them as a periodic table of elements, sort of the building blocks of reality, or in some ways they're even symbols of various archetypes that existed in the culture. And so knowing that would kind of, like, if you had a deep understanding, you would kind of be able to see how people were playing out archetypes, or how the archetypes were interacting with people around you, and, you know, ultimately sort of know what myth you were living in, as it were. It wouldn't have been quite articulated like that, but it just would have given you I would say a helpful understanding of the world around you and how things were developing, so that you'd be better able to determine how you should act in the world and how to behave. And the best way you're going to learn that is from, a good man teaching that to you and sort of showing you the ropes of how to exist in life in the proper way.
Sure. And I mean, the way skills would have been passed down back then would have definitely been person to person at that time. It's not like they would have had the internet or anything like that, or even formal schools, which I would say is not really the same thing as person to person learning sort of thing. This would have been like very direct. And yeah, I like that point a lot. The runes are super interesting though, and we're going to cover them in great detail in the next Havamal episode. So
that's true. So I'll continue on if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Stanza 121. Back to the poem. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never be the first to break friendship with your friend. Sadness will eat up your heart if you have no one you can talk to.
So I think this echoes what we were just talking about a couple of stanzas ago here, how it's like, if you don't have any friends, you're going to get depressed. I mean, that's pretty much direct here. I think this stanza would have gone better with 119 to be kind of next to that one. But, because it would be like, if you have a friend and you trust him, go and visit him often. Weeds and high grass will grow on a path that nobody travels, and never be the first to break friendship with your friend. Sadness will eat up your heart if you have no one to talk to. Like, that's big, right? Because I mean, breaking a friendship is almost more drastic than kind of letting a friendship fall apart, though, because if you break it, it's like something has happened where the friendship is no longer able to survive whatever has been done. And either it's someone's actions and the person to break the friendship is the one reacting to those actions, or, someone takes an intentional action where they know they're breaking a friendship or something like that, or breaking a promise or something where they know that that's going to be done. And I mean, I think that's also like on another level, that's like breaking the social construct of friendship, because that's something that ties us together so deeply, right? And I mean, it's clear here, it basically says you'll get depressed. They just wouldn't have had that word at the time if you have no one to talk to, right? So I mean, that's huge. And yeah, I think the entire thing here is that keep friendships around if you can. It's not easy to make friends a lot of the time, and stick with the ones that you've got, especially if they're good friends.
Absolutely. And I think it shows too that you shouldn't break up a friendship over like trivial matters, like, work it out, or if it's like a small enough matter, let it go. Like it might just not be worth it. But it's very clearly saying that you need friends and you should cultivate and protect the relationship.
Exactly.
Shall I move on? All right. We'll be doing 3 stanzas this time, 122 to 124. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. You should never exchange words with someone who won't see reason. You will never get a reward for speaking with a bad man, but a good man will make you happy with his praise. Men become friends when they can share their minds with one another. Anything is better than being lied to. A real friend will disagree with you openly.
So this is a big one. Very, very kind of dense, I suppose. Not only because it's 3 stanzas, but because what it has to say is there is a lot to unpack here, a lot. So I'll start with the first one, never exchanging words with someone who won't see reason. So on this, first I'll be clear. I don't think this means don't speak to someone who disagrees with you. I don't think that's what that's saying at all. It's good to have disagreements. And in fact, it kind of ties it together kind of at the end here. So I think that sort of proves it. You know, a real friend will disagree with you openly. It's good to have people who you disagree with, who you can talk to. That's a very, very good thing, because, you know, if you assume that the person you're talking to might know something you don't, then maybe you'll actually learn something, right? But I think what this is actually talking about is people who refuse to have a discussion, shutting arguments down over trivialities, like, you know, you're saying just the wrong thing, or you're saying it in the wrong way, and they refuse to have a discussion with you. This topic isn't on the table. This topic not being on the table means you can't have a conversation about it at all. I think it really contributes to the polarization we have for people to say, we're not going to discuss this topic, period. If you disagree with this topic, you are some variation of bigoted, on the one hand, which is often like the accusation by people on nominally the left, accusing people of, you know, being bigoted, racist, homophobic, transphobic, whatever. Any of the above can fall under bigoted. But from the other side, you know, if you don't question, you know, the way the U.S. government is working, for example, right now, and maybe you get called unpatriotic, that's just as bad. That's just as bad coming from the right, where it's like, if you question how things are going, well, you're unpatriotic. If you question that a war is going on, for example, you're unpatriotic. That's just as bad. That's shutting things down for, well, again, I would call it a triviality, because it's like you're shutting down the argument, not even an argument. You're shutting down the discussion before the discussion has even happened, because you hear that someone might have this opinion that you disagree with, but it's almost a sacred cow opinion. You can't disagree with that. And I mean, I'm not gonna dig into specific examples here on that, but it happens so much. And I mean, we get into these echo chambers, right? I think the middle stanza actually kind of speaks to that in a funny way. You know, you'll never get a reward for speaking with a bad man. A good man will make you happy with his praise. It says something about being choosy with who you talk to, but I don't think it's saying go into an echo chamber, right? That's just people that you consider good, based on your definition of good. If it's just people who agree with you, it's just going to bounce back and forth. And I mean, we've got statistics on that, how on Twitter, the left and the right never talk to each other. Like it happens, but it's not nearly as much as the echo chambers within, you know, their circles, right? And I mean, that's not the only axis we can talk about it here. Left and right is really kind of crude sometimes, but it really turns into like opposing sides on a different opinion. Maybe they have some volleys going across, but a lot of times it just turns into an echo chamber. And I think this is what this is all talking about, is like, the people who won't see reason aren't the people who disagree with you. And I would go so far as to say as well, it's not people who still disagree with you after you've made your argument. If they still disagree with you after you've made your argument, maybe that means your argument isn't as good as you thought it was. Or it means that they still have some reason that your argument didn't account for and didn't convince them. Regardless, any of the above being true, I think what this says, bottom line, is it's not worth speaking to people who refuse to have a conversation. Ironically, right? Because it's sort of like, usually it's not that they're refusing to have a conversation in the case of, oh, I'm not going to talk to you. It's usually refusing to have a conversation in the case of like, well, you're a terrible person for holding this opinion, something like that. And they almost ironically refuse to let it go. It's almost like they want you to come over to the correct opinion, or they won't stop talking to you, ironically.
Oh, for sure. This reminds me of a book that I had to read in university called, let's see if I get this right, Science, Gnosticism, and Politics, by a philosopher named Eric Voegelin. And Eric Voegelin was he was a Jew right before World War II, teaching at a university, and was able in Germany and was able to get out before things got really bad. He moved to the U.S. and he basically spent his life arguing against collective ideologies. And one of the arguments, or one of the signs that he says you can see of an ideology that, we'll call it like a false ideology or a false reality, something where his big point was you have to take reality as it comes to you and deal with it you have to deal with reality on reality's terms, because basically you're a mere human and you don't have the power of a god to change reality. This is how it is. How do you interact with it? And I think it's something that you and I see it in the mythologies, that this is all of it is them trying to interact with reality and deal with it on its own without imposing their ideas on it, on how it should be. So one of the ways, and it's sort of the prime way you can tell when someone is trying to impose their way on reality and force you to see the world as they see it, is that they prohibit questions. And it's not just saying you can't ask questions and say, oh, you can't ask that. It could be, I mean, we see this in the news frequently when, someone is making a speech somewhere and someone pulls a fire alarm and makes it so that you can't speak. Or, that's actually a pretty good example right there. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that, or by calling you a name if you question something that's sort of a sacred cow. So it's usually like unpatriotic, for example, or bigot or whatever. Nazi. Yeah. And actually his, one of his examples is quite interesting because it's about communism. And Marx talks about the socialist man, and that, if you question the origin of the socialist man, or the validity of the socialist man, well, you obviously haven't progressed enough to become the socialist man, and so your question is invalid. And you're like, well, wait a second, that doesn't, like, you're not saying anything. And that's unreasonable. There's no reason behind it. And it's not, you're exactly right. Like, it's not, people who disagree with you aren't the unreasonable ones. It's ones who don't let you engage with them through whatever means, whether it's fancy wordplay or violence. And I definitely see I see the advice of not interacting with those people, because they're going to shut you down and they're not listening. They're just not listening. And I think that's why also we're seeing this resurgence of, the long form discussion or whatever on the so-called, intellectual dark web, because people are getting together. They are disagreeing in a reasonable fashion and having these long discussions so that they can reason it out. And even if they don't convince the other person, they're doing it in good faith, and that both want sort of to figure out the truth, or the closest that they can get to the truth of reality, really, and not impose themselves on reality, but sort of let reality reveal itself to them and figure out the best way to get to it and deal with it. And we're not seeing that in any of, I would say, any of the mainstream media. It's just one or the other, and the others are terrible, horrible people, and they should shut up. But we are seeing that resurgence in this IDW, which is awesome, because we're seeing it here too. That a real friend will disagree with you openly, and I think in the intellectual dark web, you are seeing like powerful friendships being forged, even though that they they disagree on a whole bunch of things, but they disagree in good faith and with reason.
Yeah, it's the crazy thing about it is that it seems like it would be reasonable to be able to have conversations about important issues, and I mean the trouble about it is that a lot of the reason that some of these things become sacred cows, for example, is because of compassion on one hand, where it's like, well, we're going to stand up for marginalized people and anyone who says anything that we perceive, and that's key, perceive as attacking that group, has to be just destroyed, because this is something that we can't tolerate, because this group of people has already had it bad enough, and well, we can't let them continue to take any abuse. But that's often not what's happening. There's the difference between actual abusive behavior, which is also wrong, by the way, and having an opinion that goes against the standard orthodoxy of, on the one hand, I'll say the social justice movement in general, and on another hand, and this being another big movement, would be, say, like the patriotic right. Those two groups very, very particularly seem to be very engaged in demonizing the other, and, well, not having conversations between either of them. And I mean, on the patriotic right, just so I'm not spending too much time on fixating on the left, it seems like at the moment it's groups on the left who are concerned with social justice that seem to be shutting down conversations and deplatforming people, which would be the word for pulling the fire alarm at the talk, or
definitely,
or not like protesting to the point where something gets canceled, or at least protesting and saying, I think this talk should be canceled, even if they've never actually listened to the person speak who they're accusing, as an example. But the patriotic right is another example of this, where it's like anything that challenges, say, the military, or challenges their stances on immigration, or their stances on crime, for example, any of those things, the police. Challenging that for them is unpatriotic, or not supportive of the police, or it just means you want to flood the market with cheap jobs from illegal immigrants, something like that. And then they shut down the conversation coming the other way, where it's like, you can't have a conversation about that from either perspective. And I mean, I think those two are essentially the groups that are at odds on both ends, but it's this polarization that turns into just a terrible situation, because no one will talk to each other, and having the conversation is the answer, I think. And I mean, I've seen plenty of examples against free speech, plenty of arguments against free speech that essentially say, well, if something is racist, or if something is bigoted, or whatever, what have you, well, shouldn't we shut that down because it has the potential to do harm? And the thing is, like, where does it end? I don't want to get into the idea of, like, I'm saying all the default arguments of slippery slope sort of thing, but it's like, when it comes to speech, it's like, yeah, like, where are you going to draw the line on that? And then even further, it's like, you know, what if someone who you don't like is in power and making those decisions? Everyone's got to be free to do that. But the answer to speech you disagree with, or especially speech you consider hateful, is to disagree with it, and to disagree with it openly. And the ideas will kind of fall on their own. I do acknowledge that some people have louder microphones than others. And the reason why I will acknowledge that is because, I mean, that's a common enough argument where it's like minorities or oppressed groups, something like that, they might have less means of, say, purchasing advertising time or booking a hall or something like that. And sure, that's something. That is definitely something. But again, what's the solution? Like, are you going to say no one can purchase a haul or buy advertising time or something like that, I would actually be willing to have a conversation. Well, I would be willing to have a conversation about anything, just by the way. But I would be much more willing to come to the table as far as, no one's allowed to rent an auditorium again versus these specific people can't rent an auditorium just because of their situation. That's dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And, free speech is one of those things that it's just such an important ingredient in, everything that at least Western civilization is built on. And I mean, now with the internet, it's like bigger than the Gutenberg press in terms of democratizing speech. And I think I can see why people would be afraid of so-called hate speech, because I think ultimately it would diffuse their power. I think if you're there's a power thing there if you're worried about hate speech, because for free speech, I guess proponents, people who love it, when they see speech that's not nice, and let's be clear, there's like speech that is like legally bound, like if you're to threaten someone, and we're not talking about that there's already things in place that prevent the promotion of violence in a real way, like that's shutting down speech, really. That's what it is.
But it's doing it for a very good reason, because
and what I mean too is that, like, if you're threatening someone, that's often shutting down their speech. It's like so threats are a no-go, but in terms of things like, air quote hate speech, you say, we don't want that out in the open. Actually, no, you do want that out in the open, because if it's not, they're not going to stop talking and saying these things. It's going to be underground. It's going to be more attractive because it's going to be taboo, and you're not going to be able to track it. Like that's a very practical problem with suppressing speach.
Yeah, as a very pertinent example of that, actually, the Daily Stormer or Sturmer was a website. I say is a website that essentially existed until Charlottesville was when it got shut down. The riots, or whatever you want to call it, at Charlottesville, the incidents, including the death of an anti-racist protester. I'll call her what most people call her anyway. The Daily Stormer, I think it is like self-described as a Nazi newspaper, like a neo-Nazi web newspaper sort of thing. And the web registrar that gave it its domain name pulled it. And for a little while there, it tried bouncing around between other smaller domain registrars or something like that, but no one would take them. So hooray, they disappeared. Hooray. Nope. They're on the dark web now. And I don't want to say that and that's also confusing, because intellectual dark web, I don't like that name. I think it's a misnomer, because it's not like it's intellectually, it's something like you have to load up your Tor browser in order to go get it. I don't like the name. I don't think and some of the members of the intellectual dark web don't like the name, and they keep on saying it's Eric Weinstein's baby, and he loves it, but everyone else is kind of either lukewarm. No one else loves it, just Eric Weinstein. But anyway, the Daily Stormer is on the dark web now, and it's essentially only people who know exactly how to access it that can access it. And they're still having all the same conversations that they used to have. And tracking it it's hard. I mean, I'm sure the argument could be made like, oh, no, like people know how to track this stuff. And it's like, okay, sure. But I certainly don't know how to track that stuff when it's on the dark web, and it's only people who know how to access it that can access it. And that's fine for them, because they can still have all the conversations they wanted, and their message still gets out to all of their people, but it's not out in the open anymore. You used to be able to go onto the Daily Stormer and see exactly what they're saying. Now you can't. And yeah, that's dangerous.
Yeah, I don't think that's a net benefit to not be able to. I mean, say what you want. They were at least very honest about who they were and what they wanted and all that kind of stuff, which is great for the rest of us, because then we can take them at their word and be like, okay, you're some crazies, like. But
these are the guys we're not inviting to the party.
Exactly. And because that's the thing about free speech, is that there's the freedom to say it, but you can't force people, one, to listen to you or to take you seriously or, agree with you. You can't make people do that. You can just say it.
That's why the reverse is interesting, the deplatforming thing, because the entire trouble with that is that these events wouldn't happen if there weren't demand. That's pretty much exactly clear, is that, lecture series or whatever, or speaking at a university or something, it wouldn't happen without a group of people saying, hey, we want you to come speak, or, there being enough book sales by the speaker in a certain region because I think that is how that works. And that's how like music touring works and something like that. They base it off of like music sales in a geographical area or something like that. I heard that once. I might be wrong because I heard that once, but I'm at least admitting where I got that. But I think that's how it works for like, authors or something like that. It's like they see that there is enough demand and, they put a show out and it sells out, and then they have to go to a bigger venue 4 months later in the same place, sort of thing, just because there's so much demand, right? And the deplatforming movement that wants people who they're targeting, people want to hear them speak. And it's not like it's a secret. They're doing it in public. Anyone can go buy a ticket and go hear it and listen to what's going on. And it's not, well, first of all, usually with a deplatforming thing, it's not that bad. With some exceptions, there are certainly people that are associated with, actual neo-Nazis and things like that. And, maybe what they're saying is that bad. But, at the same time, like, go protest what they're saying. But it's like, still let them speak, because then they'll hang themselves with their own words.
Exactly. That with groups and people like that, you actually don't need to do much other than really amplify what they're saying, because it's going to show everyone, like, how awful what they're saying is, or how ridiculous or unreasonable, like there's no end to, and maybe you will get people who agree with it more, and but I think in general, the ratio of people who you're now introducing, these crazy people to, versus being able to like laugh at them and dismiss them out of hand, I think those people greatly outnumber the people who are going to agree with them and then, write their screeds in their mom's basement.
Right. That's the funny thing, is that every time these deplatforming people, or whatever you want to call them, make a big stink about someone speaking, it's like, that's free publicity. Thank you. Like, it's not doing your cause any favor, as far as I'm concerned, to do that, because again, like, I think it's just publicity for it. And I mean, I'm not one for taking what people say out of context, sort of thing, but I can picture Trevor Noah like just reading like a paragraph of what someone says on his daily show, sort of thing, and like that's exactly how you're like, this is specifically why this person is terrible. But again, I don't want to advocate for something like that, because that would be taking people out of context extremely. And I mean, that can go badly, because sometimes certain speakers need a lot of context. Like, I'm talking like you need to watch their whole 3-hour talk for, the one snippet that gets shared on Twitter to make actual sense. Right. But
for sure,
that's, this has been quite something. But I think that the gist of it is that, well, it's good to have friends who you can disagree with, because that's actual good friendship. And, maybe something practical is to try to have conversations with people who disagree with you and have a respectful conversation about why you disagree.
Absolutely. And do it in good faith, where you're both, there's the acknowledgement that you both want the same thing. Like, for example, I remember in university, I had a lot of friends who, like a lot of really good friends who we disagreed with in sort of the way to get there, but we agreed with the main premise of we just want life to be good for people. And we disagreed on how to get there, but we never questioned each other's like commitment to not being a jerk, really is what it came down to. And I think a lot of that's, at least in the media, is being lost. I think out in the real world, a lot of people get along just fine and they have, differing opinions, but
yeah, the sad part about this whole polarization thing is I think a lot of people would find they have a lot more in common with the people that they're so-called denouncing. And like in a lot of cases, it's a difference in what they see as the ideal for society. And of course that's a thing. But if at least you got that basics of you want life to be good for people, that's pretty easy to agree with, right? It's pretty easy to find common ground with that.
Exactly.
If you disagree with that,
Exactly. Like, well, if you disagree with that, then, we've got some websites on the dark web you might be interested in, like, no, it's a weird, and one of the reasons why there's such I'll say violent reaction on both sides, sort of any radicals, is that if you're arguing with them, you're not just arguing with their idea, but their entire conception of reality. And that is a big deal. Like if you can prove everything wrong, chances are you're not going to be able to because of cognitive dissonance. They just won't allow the idea. They'll wiggle out of it and find something else, but that supports them. But because they've put so much of themselves and their identity into this one ideology, whatever it may be, then they literally have to reconstruct their understanding of the world if it's proven to them that it's false. And like, no one wants to do that. It's incredibly painful. So they're going to fight for it tooth and nail. And I think that's what we see.
Well, yeah, that'll send you straight to hell in the metaphorical sense, right? That will shatter your world. Like I've gone through that multiple times where I have, usually it's in a religious context actually, where I find that I'm losing my faith in something, and it's a big moment, and it's hard to get out of that, and sometimes it can really take a long time, and it's not just in situations like that where I've had that happen to me, and it's really hard, it's really bad, and having ideas get challenged like that, or even having new ideas challenge your worldview, it's hard. I mean, I don't blame people who are adverse to being challenged for not wanting to go through that. I do blame maybe kind of larger ringleaders in this whole thing, where it's like who are organizing all of this in order to say like big groups of people on Twitter should go on witch hunts for people who have the wrong opinion, sort of thing. Like that is, I think, wrong, and I think makes this whole thing worse. But I'm not going to blame someone for not wanting to go through hell. That's hard. You don't want to go through that. If you want to go through that without understanding exactly why you're going through that and the possible outcome, the positive outcome of doing so, because the only way to like change in any reasonable way is to go through the underworld in some regard, right? But symbolically. But I don't blame anyone who doesn't want to go through that without facing it. You know what I mean? I mean, and that's another concept that we've talked about. Is like you don't want to. You want to go into that head first, facing exactly what you're challenging. And for a lot of people, when they get challenged over their ideas, it's not that they're not expecting it, it's that they are completely unprepared to be challenged. And they're completely unprepared to stand up to a challenge and face it and integrate that and to go through the underworld, come out the other side.
Yeah, exactly. It's just unprepared and unwilling to face the the hell that awaits them.
Yeah, so I'm not going to blame anyone for not wanting to go through that, but I will put out the challenge of, if you think that just by hearing an opinion that you disagree with that possibly challenges your worldview is going to put you into that situation, unbeknownst, maybe it's time to look at your opinions, why you hold them, and why maybe they're so strong for you. Because if it's preventing you from having discussions with people in general, I don't think that's good. It says so right here.
And if it says it in the book, it's got to be true. So, I mean...
Well, yeah, because obviously everything Odin says is worth...
yeah.
Well, everything Odin says is usually pretty good, but listen to episode 17 and you'll see why you don't want to follow what Odin does.
No, that's another kettle of fish right there. I don't know if there's much more to add on...
Well, there's much more to add, but I think we've been talking about this for quite some time now.
So we can probably move on.
I think so.
Sounds good. That was good, though. I think we did a good job there. Stanza 125. I counsel you, Loddfafnir. If you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Don't speak even 3 words with a man worse than you. Often the better man will lose when a worse man fights him.
Okay, so this one almost appears to contradict exactly what was just said, and I think that's really, really funny. I think it comes across as almost like I think it's if you can consider someone with an opposing opinion of yours as being worse than you, then of course this stanza would say, don't even speak 3 words with them. But I don't think that's what that's saying at all. And I mean, I think the point is if they're worse in character. He's already talked about, a bad man will profit from your misfortunes or might, something like that. I think that's what it means. It's like someone who will drag you down to their level and will have they'll be fighting you on their plane, arguing with you, whatever. And yeah, I think it's accurate. If it turns into like an insult slinging competition and you're fighting against someone who's really good at slinging insults, or the Norse rap battles again from episode 17, Harbarge is the Oath. I think Thor was a little bit outmatched as far as Odin's ability to sling insults, and I would definitely, I wouldn't definitely say, but Odin might have been the worst person in that fight. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally, definitely.
Yeah. So, but I think this also echoes another of the rules from 12 Rules for Life, Rule 3, to make friends with people who want the best for you, which is sort of like the opposite of this stanza. It's like if you make friends with people who don't want the best for you or who are constantly dragging you down, that's going to drag you down. There was something like if you took a bad performer and put him into a good performing group, it wasn't that the good performing group made the bad performer better. It was that the bad performer made the good performing group worse. And it's the same thing here. It's like, I don't think it's so much don't speak these 3 words to a person who's worse than you because they disagree with you or because of anything so specific as all that. It's more like in an abstract sense, someone who is worse off than you because they refuse to do the same good things that you do to make your life as good as it is, something like that. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. I think we have a lot of parallels just in our sort of everyday sayings, like, casting your pearls before swine. The idea that, if you're wasting your breath giving good advice to people who aren't going to follow it. Or I've also heard one like, don't argue, or if you, it's like arguing with him is like arguing with a pig, and that you're just going to get tired and dragged through the mud, and they like it anyway. So yeah, just things like that. Like there's a whole bunch that says, just because and again, we were talking about this with the free speech, like free speech, all that means is they can say it. It doesn't mean that you have to listen or engage. And there are definitely people who aren't worthy of listening to or engaging with them because what they're saying is just so beyond the pale. So,
or at least listening to them more than once.
For sure.
Right? Because I mean, if you haven't taken the time to listen to someone just the once, I mean, it's hard to kind of pass a judgment, but sometimes it's pretty easy within not very long to tell that they're not great. So that's the only caveat I would put to
definitely.
That one, but.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you're interacting with a dirtbag human, like be careful, because their ability to be a dirtbag is greater than your ability to stay away from dirtbags. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, it's just a good warning that there are people out there who you just really shouldn't hang around because they're not worth your time. And if you get into some sort of fight with them, it's just going to make you look bad because they already look bad. They can't, there isn't like much room for them to go down any further, but for you there is. So I'll just keep that in mind.
Yeah. And I mean, I think another side to it too is that don't think you're helping someone who is, in this context, the word is like better or worse, but the idea I think is like, don't think you're helping them because they might have no desire for your so-called charity, or if you try and help them improve, I think it's actually it's better than like a low chance that they'll take you up on your advice and everything like that and like work with you sort of thing. Like they're just as likely to drag you down is kind of the problem too. So it's again interesting that ostensibly Odin understands this idea here where it's like, yeah, maybe it's not good to well, say three words, but I think maybe the other idea is like associate with people who who are in a bad situation, who don't have any desire of being helped, something like that, of making their situation better.
For sure.
Maybe that's a better way to put it, is like you can consider them worse than you if they have their aim below you, something like that. Because if someone's in a bad situation but they're aiming up, good. Like
exactly.
Like, and that's the funny thing is it's like if they're aiming up or they're aiming down. I feel like that's the only way to differentiate that, because even if someone's aiming up like just a little bit, you get far enough and they're aiming like infinite, right? Like they'll get there. It's just a matter of them having that intention. But if they don't have that intention, that's the differentiator.
For sure. I absolutely agree with that. Shall I move on?
Sure.
Stanza 126. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Don't make shoes and don't make weapons, except for yourself. If there's a flaw in the shoe or the spear shaft is crooked, your name will be cursed.
So this one is interesting. It took me a little while to kind of wrap my head around it, and I'm not sure I'm going to enunciate it all that well. So Dan, you'll have to back my ideas up on this a little bit, but confirm them or whatnot. But so first of all, I'm going to make the caveat. I think a professional is kind of exempt from this. This isn't saying don't make a living making shoes or don't make a living making weapons. I don't think that's saying that because those were essential members of society, especially at the time. That said, I think what this is saying is like, don't do things that other people would rely on if it's not your job and your livelihood, because if what you did even in your best effort is not enough or goes wrong, they'll curse your name. I don't even know if that's clear or if that's just restating what this is saying, but yeah, that's what I've got here. It's like, it's almost like, don't do things for people that might be unappreciated. Not even might, like, yeah, I don't know if I'm getting anywhere with this.
Well, I think the first part was spot on. Just that, chances are you're not a shoemaker or a weapon maker. So if you're going to make them, keep them for yourself, because these items in particular, other people are going to rely on. But again, if you are a cobbler or like a blacksmith or whatever, like by all means, do it because that's your profession. You know what you're doing, and they're not going to curse you. I think it's sort of it's a kind of like a call to mind your own business in a way that it's like the person who gives relationship advice, and if you take it, you break up your relationship. Like, they just give out bad advice and they think they're so smart because they've watched enough, whatever the doctor of the moment is on TV, and then you do it, and they have no context for your relationship or whatever, and they're giving you advice, and you're like, that makes no sense whatsoever. And so but then, like, if you were to listen to it, you'd curse their name because, oh, why did I listen to this person? They didn't know what they're talking about. Well, that's your fault for listening to them, and their fault for thinking they were an expert.
Yeah, and first of all, I think you clarified perfectly. The advice here is directed at the person who would provide that, which I think is, first of all, like, this person is altruistic, I think, in that they're doing something for someone else. But yeah, it's that criticality where it's like something that is relied upon so significantly, that should be something either done yourself because you have some desire to do that or whatever, or by a professional. That might not be so pithy, but that's pretty, it's good advice, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great advice. That's kind of all I have to say about that one. So
yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, we can, we'll move on. Stanza 127. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. When you are at war, call it war, and give your enemies no peace.
Okay, so this one is interesting, and I find it's a very complex stanza because of what it implies. I'd like to give just another reading here from Caroline Larrington, just because the nuance is different, and I think both are needed. The first part is roughly the same. Do you good if you have it, where you recognize evil, call it evil, and give no truce to your enemies. So when you are at war, call it war. Okay, so that's something that's straightforward enough. But when you recognize evil, call it evil. I think that takes it to another place where it's like, it's almost like the onus is on you. If you consider something to be evil, call it evil, and then you're at war. Give your enemies no peace. It's brutal. And I think it also seems to contradict the ideas that we were talking about earlier, mostly related to free speech again, because it leaves the door open for, again, these sayings of like, oh, because this person is saying something, they are evil, they are my enemy, we're at war, we're going to give them no peace. I think the polarization crowd basically lives up to that idea spot on. And I think the problem with that is that it's not specified who the enemy is. It's really up to you to specify who the enemy is. And I think people these days can have a hair trigger on this stuff when it's like almost something I disagree with is enough to make them my enemy. Or to maybe soften that a little bit, someone who disagrees with this specific opinion that is held to be sacred or dogma by the group of people that I agree with or by the ideology that I subscribe to, they're my enemy, right? I think it's again something like it's valid when it's darn well valid. Like there's cases where it's like, yeah, you are my enemy, you are at war. And I think the connotation on that should also be like, don't be a secret backstabber. Like you don't like someone and I think that almost actually is the correct connotation on this too, is like, don't like secretly try and sabotage someone you don't like or whatever. Like at least be upfront with it that you don't like them and you don't want them to succeed, something like that. I mean, that might make you the jerk, but I think that's the actual connotation here. But what I see as being applicable today is polarization.
For sure. And I think too, with the polarization, I mean, they did make the caveat that, you have to speak with reasonable people. And that is the key ingredient, is to be reasonable. And so and I think that's why this one is so stark, is that like if you're being reasonable and you go to war, like you go to war, then there's you don't do it halfway or whatever. And that, because I think halfway anything gets you into trouble a lot of the times. So if you've reasoned out that, yes, this is evil, okay, we're calling it evil, and then we're going after it full force, not resting until it's eradicated. Because whether we're going to call it war or evil, how are you going to win against it if you go softly after it, or if you're not committed to going after it? I mean, you'll get so far, and then something will happen in the war where evil will strike back, and like, whoa, why am I doing this? So I'm out, like I'm done. So I think it's kind of a call to honesty in action, in that if you're going to do it and be committed to it. And if you're at war, or if you're, dealing with evil, be committed to fighting either one of those. So that's sort of where I took that one.
I like that. I think that's another good way to approach this, that, yeah, like go all in. Yeah, I like that a lot. Certainly I like that compared to I think this can be used as, like you recognize evil and then therefore that's it. We're going to war. I don't think that should be done lightly. That's I don't think it would be good advice to say, whenever you see someone like that, like go to war. It puts responsibility on you as well to really be discerning on what is evil, on what war actually entails here, because, well, those aren't light words, evil is not a light word. Calling someone evil, you better be able to back that up, and going to war with someone, like, that's serious, and it should be all in, like you say. So I think this stanza is exactly right, but it's also shouldn't be taken lightly.
No, definitely not. It is not a light stanza. A lot of the stanzas in this in Loddfafnir are actually reminding me of the movie The Godfather, and figuring out how to sort of navigate that world. I mean, I'm assuming most people listening or watching have seen The Godfather. If you haven't, you should. It's a fantastic movie, and when you watch it, you're going to think, oh, this is like the most cliched gangster movie of all time. And then you realize, oh, it's because every other gangster movie took from The Godfather and just, blatantly ripped it off, with like the exception of, I'd probably say like Goodfellas and Casino. But yeah, anyway, you'll see a lot of this. And they do talk about, going to war with another mafia family and like making sure that they're actually at war and not just kind of, doing it halfway. But
Well, that's a good point. That's like, yeah, you better make sure. Like, I think a better way to look at this is a call to seriousness, as like, if you're going to go all this way here, like, you better know exactly what you're doing and that this is like the possible consequence. I would also encourage, again, anyone who wants to know a little bit more about war to go listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History Blueprint for Armageddon, because that's a description of war.
Absolutely.
That's also probably not in the capabilities of any one person or even like most groups of people to do today, but that's what war is. Just saying.
Also, Jocko, he would have a lot to say about this, and you could pretty much pick up any episode of his and go in with this idea: when you're at war, call it war and give your enemies no peace. Like, that's basically his show in a nutshell. Like,
yeah, I can't recommend Jocko enough. No. So I don't think we can get through a Havamal episode. We probably did, but maybe the love one. We talk about Jocko a lot when it comes to Havamal because he says some very wise things.
Definitely. Yeah, no, it's it's funny how, well, it's just a lot of the lessons in this are, time tested and they're true. So
yeah, and that's for those of you unfamiliar with Jocko, he's like an ex-Navy SEAL, and he's he comes by his way of thinking through having acted it for a long time in like super stressful doesn't even cover it. Yeah. Like the most intense situations that many humans are able to endure. And he's learned leadership principles. He has a great book, Extreme Ownership. And he's got another one coming out soon. I think it's on pre-order. I forget what it's called. It's not one of his other normal cliches, though, is it? I say cliches.
No, like catchphrases.
Catchphrases. That's better because I say them all the time. It's not discipline equals freedom. It's something like.
Although he does have a book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And
that's why. Yeah,
and it's an interesting, almost like an artistic meditation on discipline and freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very good book. Very, very good podcast. Highly, highly, highly recommend.
Absolutely.
Especially if you want to know more about this stanza. At the very minimum, the spirit behind it from the way I interpret it. Thank you for bringing that up.
No worries.
Because that's exactly right.
Shall we continue?
Yeah.
Stanza 128. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never be glad to hear bad news, but be cheerful about good news.
So this is pretty straightforward, right?
I think for the most part.
Like, I don't even see how this isn't like exactly what on the face of it is. Like, I mean, don't be happy about bad things. I mean, that can be something that can be hard to do if it's like you're hearing bad things that are happening about your enemy, about other people you don't like. And maybe that ties into something like resentment over people you don't like. Can you actually feel pleasure over them, like, failing? Like Schadenfreude, but to the extreme, like there's Schadenfreude in like one sense where it's like comical or something like that. But then I think this is actually like you're glad to hear bad news, like there's finding some negative situation to have some humor or something like that. But then there's like actually being glad, and that's probably not a good thing. That probably puts you into a bad space, resentment again, or like maybe you're like a cruel person or something like that. But like other than that, though, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, exactly. Don't rejoice in the suffering of others is sort of what it is. It's funny that in Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita is basically one of the main themes of it and it's this huge epic poem, is very much this. Prince Arjuna is about to go to war against another nation, but the other nation is still his family because there's intermarrying, and he loves his cousins and his cousins love him, but they have to go to war for whatever reason, and so he's really distraught about having to fight this other nation, and I think it's Krishna who takes the form of his chariot driver. Talks to him about the importance of doing his duty as a soldier, but not taking undue pleasure in the killing of his enemy. And I think this is obviously a big issue, big enough that they wrote an epic poem about it. So that this is it's obviously a problem because they're addressing it like this, and we're getting a whole stanza just for it. So. Yeah, I would say don't rejoice in other people's suffering. Even if you have to do harm to another person, you don't have to rejoice in it and revel in it. You can just do the job and get it over. So an example might be, if you and some other person are up for the same job and you end up getting it. That's really good for you. And, for all intents and purposes, you had to get that job because it's going to give you money and all that kind of stuff. But so did he. And you could be like, yeah, this guy's not getting the job. I got it, or you can just be like, well, okay, I got the job, but I have no ill will towards this person. And that I think is the key there.
Great summary. As an aside, the Bhagavad Gita I think is super interesting just because of its framing. It's the Mahabharata that it's a part of, right? Which I think is it's something it's longer than all of the works of Homer or something like that. It's this monstrous thing, but then right in the middle of it is this poem, this Bhagavad Gita, which is long in and of itself. It's printed as full books, and it's apparently the core of Hinduism in the period where they started to revere Krishna and other gods kind of more personally than in the Vedic times. And it's a kind of a turning point in their whole thing. Yeah, I like that you brought that up. I don't remember a lick of what it says, but I remembered it because of its framing. I thought it was really interesting. It's in the middle of this big war, and I guess the entire big epic poem is all in the middle of this big war and other cool things, but I don't remember any of it, but so I'm glad you brought the substance, but I remembered the way it was set. So
if we didn't have so much to do here and India was in Northern Europe, I'd be like, hey, let's cover that sometime. But I think
well, maybe when we've exhausted Northern Europe, maybe, but
and then come back from the dead and
exactly
it's certainly worth if someone out there is wanting to do a podcast, doing kind of the same things, do that. That's an interesting thing. That would be.
Yeah, start with the Rig Veda and go through the Mahabharata. I think you'd probably have to, I think even reading it aloud would probably take years.
Yeah, and that's not even counting the Upanishads and all that kind of stuff either. So there's...
Well, if you the Upanishads, if you're being super pedantic, they're part of the Vedas, aren't they? They're addendums to it.
Yeah, there's just a whole bunch of... I think the Vedic knowledge goes first, and then and we're talking thousands of years later, then we're getting Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and
but in the four Vedas, isn't it they have an actual Vedic section, then they have an Upanishad section, then they have another section or something like that, and it's all called the Veda, but it's not all from the Vedic time, and it's super confusing like that, which is really just to say it would take you so long to get through it,
but it'd be interesting.
Super interesting. Yeah. You would count us as some of your first subscribers.
Absolutely.
Or someone find us this podcast, because
I would also, I'd be open to that as well. Just if you know of it, let us know, because we'll probably listen to it.
Yeah. I darn well haven't seen it around, so maybe because it's so gigantic, but would be super cool.
Definitely.
And that's just a big aside right there.
All right. Shall I move on?
Yeah.
Sounds good. Stanza 129. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. You should never look up when you're in a fight. Men who do so may get turned to stone. Beware, or someone may curse you.
So this one I thought was super interesting. So looking up when you're in a fight. So I think what that is saying specifically is taking your eye off whatever particular goal you have at any one moment, which, in a fight would be your opponent, the person or people swinging deadly objects at you or shooting at you or something like that. But turning to stone is super interesting because I think what it's saying here is paralysis by the unknown. It's what happens when you get encountered with the unknown and are completely unprepared for it. The idea of like a Medusa or something like that is like specifically this story embodied and personified. It's right for the Medusa to be a goddess because if you've been following along with us, it's symbolically feminine. It's the symbolically feminine aspect of the unknown, which can turn you into stone if you are unprepared to see it, unprepared to encounter it. And I think the idea here is that, when you're in a fight, when you're in something so life and death, you're in a situation where the unknown things all around you can completely paralyze you. Oh man. Like, I think this is actually referring to maybe even something like PTSD. Like, if you look around yourself and you see the horrors of battle all around you, maybe that's something there where it's like when you take that sort of thing and it just like it changes a person. And again, like if you haven't noticed, I just finished listening to Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon Hardcore History, but he talks about this where it's like you see the things all around you and it's like all these horrible, horrible things. Then you have like literal generations of men who either die or are so traumatized by what's they've seen and has been going on around them that like turn to stone. I mean, I've heard of both of my two of my great grandfathers I know of were in World War I and never talked about the war. And I mean, what else is that? Like, if you're not able to talk about it, like turning to stone, that's a pretty good metaphor. But even like if we're going to extend it, it's like you're paralyzed by the unknown. You're just terrified and you can't act. And if you're in a fight, well, then you're dead.
Yeah, definitely. I took actually a more literal sort of sense of this because when you're fighting, specifically like hand to hand, you generally keep your chin down, and so you're looking down. And if you lift up and lift your chin, you can get hit and knocked out cold like a stone. You get laid out like a stone. I think it's true on all of these levels, actually. Like, absolutely. Like, and that's that's the beauty of this particular stanza, is that you have all these different levels that it works on, sort of in the same way. Like, you're not shuffling things around much as you go up the levels. It's like, yeah, you took your eyes off the prize. You looked up. You got knocked out. Well, in a fight, okay, yeah, like it just keeps going. Every level, it's the same thing, but just on a different scale.
Yeah, and then someone cursing you. I mean, I think it's the same thing. It's like, what other kind of explanation would there be for like someone just like freezing on the battlefield? Like, oh, he got cursed. Like, that seems logical. I'm not kidding. That seems like a pretty good explanation for someone who is altogether, usually, especially in a fighting situation, maybe because that's kind of the way things were back then. And then like look around them and they're frozen, sort of thing, like enemy witches, something like that.
Well, for sure. And just the amount of danger that's around you. I mean, you're trying to collect an insurmountable amount of data around you in a battle to figure out what to do next. Well, like, there's no reason to suspect that if you go left, that you won't get randomly killed by an arrow, or someone will sneak up behind you and get you. And the chances of those things happening if you go left are exactly the same chances of them happening to you if you go right or forward or backward, or if you like drop to the ground and pretend you're dead. Like, there's no good options. You just have to pick one. And then if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But you don't have any good options. It's all kind of a crapshoot. You're gambling.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that is, on a symbolic level, the enunciation of that paralysis. Like, it's the paralysis of indecision maybe as well. And I mean, indecision is not necessarily the same thing as like a terrified rat in a cage, which I really like that example, because there was the idea that you could teach a rat to be afraid, and it was like they would shock these rats while shining a light on them. And then eventually, whenever they would shine the light on the rat, it would sort of act like it was shocked, like it would freeze and like kind of look like it was anticipating anyway, being in pain, sort of thing, like it had been shocked. But then they put the rat into a brand new cage, and the rat does the same thing. It's completely terrified because it's unknown. The cage that it's in is not explored, and the rat treats any cage or situation that it has not explored thoroughly as a place where there might be a thing that eats rats, and it's terrified, and its first reaction is to freeze. And I think that's something similar anyway. Freezing at exposure to the unknown when you're not prepared for it.
For sure. And like in this case, in a fight, it's like the malevolent unknown. It's not undifferentiated chaos. It is out to get you chaos.
Right. I think that is a good point. And I think that is also a part of the Medusa story, the symbolism. It's like, yeah, it's malevolence that will do that to you.
For sure. Shall I move on?
Definitely.
Stanza 130. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. If you want to win a good woman, speak cheerfully with her, and enjoy it while you do. Make promises to her and keep your promises. You'll never regret winning such a prize.
This is another one that I think is fairly straightforward on the face of it, and it's actually quite clear. For Odin's advice about love is often a little obscured, shall we say. But in this case, it's like, yeah, this is exactly it. I mean, speaking cheerfully and enjoying it, like, yeah. Definitely. And making and keeping promises is definitely a big deal too, because it's like you're going to have to show that you're trustworthy, worthy of love from a good woman. But if you do that, it's like an action. And no, I can definitely speak from experience. You won't regret it, because it's worth doing. If you find a good woman, yeah, definitely these things are at least good contributors to getting a good life, and you will not regret it.
Finally, something that's like hopeful and not rapey coming out of, the Norse myths. It's definitely good advice. And like you're saying, it's about showing that you're worthy of her, that you're worthy of her love, and that you're going to be able to you're going to be able to not be useless as you go forward, and that you'll actually be able to provide things for both of you. And yeah, no, it's fantastic, and definitely a welcome breath of fresh air after hearing all about seducing people's wives and whatever other unsavory things out. And I guess in this, if we could throw Frey in there as well, and his servant, Skirnus. Yeah. So, yeah, don't listen to any of the other stuff. Listen to this one. This is how you're going to actually, and also how you avoid a lot of the lying and sorceress's arms and things like that. It's how you'll be able to avoid that. So,
yeah, it's so wholesome, right? Almost surprisingly. And I mean, no, it's great. Like, speak cheerfully and enjoy it. Like, yeah, definitely. That's exactly it. It's like, just have a good time together and enjoy each other's company. Like, if you can't do that, like, come on. No, that's so good, and it's so right. And it also emphasizes the responsibility of being in a relationship with someone who deserves a good person. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying the listener here is the good person. The good woman is the person who deserves someone good. You have a responsibility there. You got to make your promises and keep them. Like, it's not trivial. It's no joke to be in a long-term committed relationship, in a marriage, as most usually turn into. Like, it's not trivial, and you got to work at it, but it's worth it. It's so worth it.
I agree. I was wondering if this would just turn into a competition on how great marriage is, just in case our wives were listening. But my wife doesn't listen to this, so I don't need to. I don't need to compete.
Oh, that's honest of you.
But no, that's exactly right. It's a worthwhile endeavor. It's one of the ways in which you set your sights on the highest good, and then work to achieve it.
I miss my wife. She's been away on business for a while, and I miss her.
I feel you. Shall I move on?
Sounds good.
I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. I advise you to be wary, though never fearful. Be most wary about drinking, about other men's women, and about a third thing, about men and their temptation to steal.
Now, this one is kind of funny. So we've covered drinking. If you want a refresher, our first episode on the Havamal is a very, very good one. Lots about not drinking too much in that one. But if it needed to be re-emphasized, the thing you should be most wary about is drinking. And lots of examples of that. Other men's women. I think again we've covered that in this episode. Odin doesn't follow that advice necessarily, but you don't want to fragment the social structure and anything like that, and be the one who's going to unravel the sanctity of marriage or whatever.
Exactly. You don't want any of that.
Don't want that at all. But the other one, the last one here about men and their temptation to steal. So what's funny is that could almost be like directly about like be worthy of men who might want to steal your wife or something, seduce your wife sort of thing. But more generally, I think it's like, yeah, men are generally competitive, and yeah, like it's not wrong that often men will try and take things that aren't theirs if they can. That's not wrong, and yeah, be aware of it, safeguard against it. Those are good things to do.
Oh, for sure. Men are competitive, and they're going to try and take what you have for themselves, even even if they do it in an I could say honorable way, not so they're not necessarily stealing it, but they're still taking it from you. If they're better at something than you are, then they're going to get something that you wanted. And you can actually go pretty far in life just with these three things. Don't be crazy about drinking, but also don't fear it. Just acknowledge that it can take your wits from you. Don't go after women who you shouldn't go after, and recognize that there's always going to be someone, a man, coming to take what you believe is yours. That's a recipe to climb up the hierarchy right there.
For sure. It doesn't give you very clear instructions beyond that, but it certainly gives you things to look out for, which is important, helpful.
Absolutely. Shall I move on?
Let's do it.
Stanza 132. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never mock, never laugh at a guest nor a wanderer. Those inside the house rarely know anything about the stranger who knocks at their door. But there is no man so good that he has no flaw, nor a man so bad he's good for nothing.
So this one is at the same time optimistic and pessimistic, and as well, it almost is a take on the idea of the unknown and being wary of the unknown, but applying it specifically to people, which I don't know if so clearly that's been done so far. It's always been the unknown as kind of a general thing, and he's spoken about like kinds of bad people sort of thing, but in this one it's very clearly it's like you don't know about a stranger until you get to know someone. You don't know their character. You don't know what they're capable of. You don't know that if you insult them, they won't slit your throat. You don't know if you mock them, that's going to send them into depression and they're going to drink themselves to death. It's like, it can be bad for you. It could be bad for the world to take it lightly what they're capable of, and to take it lightly the social contract of being nice.
For sure. And I think there's a call here too that, or at least a notice that, you could meet a wanderer or a stranger who is charming and wonderful, but they are going to have a flaw. And until you see that, you might not want to be as vulnerable to them as you might want to be if, because they're so charming and nice. Likewise, there could be a wanderer who comes by and he's, gruff and rude, but, there could come a point where that is what you need in a situation, and he actually comes to the rescue. So it's kind of don't judge a book by its cover, but also like more than that, and that you want to get to know people before you start making yourself vulnerable to them by relying on them in some way.
Yeah, well, I mean, Odin is the example of the wanderer who you don't want to get too close to, for sure. But yeah, I think that's why I said it's like, it's both optimistic and pessimistic. It's like, yeah, even like the ones who look like they're a sure good thing, like they can be dangerous and have some evil in them, or just a flaw. I mean, that's not, a flaw doesn't have to be serious, but it's also a good reminder that pretty much everyone has some good in them, and that's optimistic if you can be looking for that in people.
Absolutely. Shall I move on?
Sounds good.
So stanza 134. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never laugh at an old man. There is often wisdom in what old men say. Wise words will often come from a gray-bearded mouth, from those who hang with dried skins, those who swing with dried skins, those who wave with dried skins.
Not gonna lie, I have no idea about the dried skins part, but the whole rest of it seems pretty clear. Like, the elders of the world are those who have been here for a lot longer and have had a lot more time to accumulate wisdom. Why wouldn't we listen to that? Like, really, I don't see there being anything wrong there. Like anything beyond that, as far as like, yeah, I mean, maybe it's like an idea of maybe sometimes people in their old age get stuck in their ways that don't work anymore, and it's hard to really see the value in what they have to say, but sometimes they have old ideas that have been forgotten and are at risk of being lost. And, it's much harder to rediscover something good and positive than it is to reinvigorate old ideas. And I think, that's a good reason why listening to elders is valuable.
Absolutely. I wonder if the talk about dried skin is just like them being, skin has lost elasticity as they've grown old and they've become weathered. But yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the old people have lived a long time and survived a long time, so there's obviously great wisdom there, because I don't think you can do either of those, live long and survive long without at least gaining something that's worthwhile that someone would be able to find a lot of use in as far as advice goes. So yeah, it's and I'm not sure that we do that too much as a society anymore. We do seem to worship youth right now, but a lot of the more traditional societies, they do place their elders in a revered spot. So shall I continue?
Sure.
Stanzas 135 and 136. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Never spite a guest, nor be stingy with your food. Treat a poor wanderer well. Otherwise, it's a bitter tree you'll find yourself hanging from, in the sight of all. Give a beggar something, or he will call curse down on your every limb.
Yeah, so this one, I think, has some interesting nuances to it, I'll say that, where it's sort of like, if you've got a guest, maybe that's kind of a symbol of, well, first of all, it's that the idea of hospitality kind of in general, but it's also like, if you break that, it's two-sided here. If you break that bond of hospitality, of of course you don't deserve the structures of society that kind of have supported you, sort of thing. But it's interesting that it goes to, give a beggar something, or he'll call a curse down on you. It's certainly a call to help the less fortunate in society, and not to let those who have not succeeded under the current system to just kind of languish there. And well, the imagery is very specific here, where it's like, you'll be hanging from a bitter tree. Like, that's like, you'll be executed. Like, that really is the punishment for I suppose sort of in that day and age of not being full in your hospitality. But the lesson on that, I think, is something like, be generous to people and pay back good faith and good things with other good things. And I don't know, maybe it's a little bit kind of, not light, that's not the right word, but, something like that.
For sure. And I think if you sort of take it up a level and just look at it sort of as society, you want to make sure that there aren't a lot of people who are sort of piling up at zero, at having nothing, because it's a destabilizing force, and like, you will find the society hanging from a bitter tree, and maybe even you personally, because usually what happens is if there's a revolution, the rich people who weren't who were stingy, they end up hanging or being executed or anything like that. So I think it's just a call that you don't want vast disparity in your society.
Yeah. Great point. I don't think I had gone specifically there, but yeah, I think that's just right. The disparity and everything, and almost societal incentives for not letting it get that bad.
Absolutely. All right, shall we hit the last stanza?
Let's do it.
This is a big one, but it's full of good advice, I would say. And it's the last bit of advice that Odin has for Loddfafnir. I counsel you, Loddfafnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. When you drink beer, choose the might of the earth, for the earth is good against beer, and fire against sickness, oak against an irritable bowel, wheat against magic, an elder tree against family quarrels, maggots against venomous bites, runes against distress, ground against water. Swear your hate beneath the moon.
This one is all over the place, first of all, but it's good. It's united in kind of a thread of use the proper thing in the proper place for its proper use. And it's certainly not like from a negative standpoint, as in, this thing will be wrong for that. It's like, this is right here. This is right here. It's talking about like some things that are, fire is one of those things that can be very destructive, but here it can be creative. It's warmth for a sick person, Maggots are good for venomous bites. That's something we still do today. Not in all the cases that used to be used for, but yeah, like that's a big deal. The elder tree for family quarrels. That's like people coming to the tree to meet and discuss their problems. This whole stanza, I think, is great in the sense that it's like, do the right thing in the right situation and know what to use in the right situation.
Absolutely. I'm very curious about, like wheat being effective against magic. Also oak against an irritable bowel. Like I guess they would eat oak if they were having tummy trouble. So I don't know.
Maybe that's an herbal remedy. Yeah. That I don't know.
And then there's, I also like the runes against distress. And I think part of the idea behind that is even if the runes don't actually have any magical powers, if you believe they do, that it'll actually relieve distress because you feel like you're affecting the situation. Even if you're not, you'll have that belief that you are. It can also kind of reorient you with the highest good, possibly if you're going to use it in sort of that magical way. But other than that, yeah, these are kind of like the last few things that Loddfafnir might need to know, like, if you're drinking beer, like make sure you're eating with it, because that will make sure that you're not getting as drunk as you could be, and it'll help with the hangover the next day. Or it's just these little tidbits of information that they kind of actually didn't fit together in other places in the poem, but it's still things that are important to know. And it's like when you're leaving on a trip or moving out of the house for the first time and your mom is like giving you all these disparate pieces of advice. It's like, and remember that, when you're washing your clothes, make sure that you're using the Color Guard detergent. And when you make macaroni tonight, make sure that, you turn the oven off at the end. Like, there's nothing to do with either one of those things, but she's just rhyming off all the things she wants to make sure you remember before, you're off on your own. And that's sort of what I saw when I saw this. It was just these different things that Odin wanted to rhyme off before Loddfafnir left.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Lots of good things here. And if we're looking at a common thread through all of it, it's like know how to know, almost something like that. Like,
sure.
Know when things are right for the right situation, and just kind of on a general level, which is very good. And I think that's it for the advice to Loddfafnir.
Yeah, that covers that section of the Havamal, and then we just have the rune poem left, and that'll be that. So as we finish off here, another big thank you to Jackson Crawford for his translation of the Poetic Edda, and Hackett Publishing. Make sure I don't get the glare there too much. Yeah. We've got a link basically on most of our pages on how to pick that up from Amazon, as well as the YouTube link to Jackson Crawford's YouTube channel, where you can find all sorts of good information on the Norse language and Norse myths, so that really it's a great foundation for what we're doing here. And I know we've definitely used his expertise. I also give a thank you out to Dr. Jordan Peterson, because his work has really inspired this podcast, and specifically his biblical lectures. We basically have taken that and looked at the Norse myths with that model, but also his university courses. You can find it all on his YouTube page, and they're all definitely worthwhile. I mean, it'll take you a long time to get through, but it'll be like one of the best things you've ever gone through. So definitely worthwhile. We also mentioned the Jocko podcast, and we're both huge fans, so we'll definitely give a shout out to him. We'll have a link to his podcast. It's excellent. Definitely check it out. And I would say the best part about it is that all of the sort of theoretical things that we're talking about, he comes at the exact same principles, but from actually having done them and learned about them because he's lived them. And that's sort of what makes worth, in addition to it just being interesting, but the parallels are pretty incredible, how they meet in how sort of action and thought meet with Jocko. And we've also mentioned Dan Carlin. I mean, he's probably one of the most famous podcasters, but his hardcore history is phenomenal. Definitely check that out. He talks about all sorts of different topics, and it doesn't really matter what he's doing a show on. You're going to learn a ton. And again, like another inspiration for us, because just at how interesting and how in depth he goes. It's sort of something for us to aim for. If we could get to that level of depth, I think we'd be pretty proud of ourselves. Even if like we got halfway, it'd still be pretty amazing. Luke, do you want to tell us how people can reach us?
Sure. So you can get a hold of us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can email us on all these platforms. We're some variation of at Northern Myths. It's at Northern Myths for Twitter, Facebook, Northern Myths Podcast for Instagram. And you can reach us at northernmythspodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to email us. And we're both personally on Twitter as well. North Myth Luke and North Myth Dan. We're both on there actively personally, both on the joint account and on our personal accounts. And, if you'd like to give us a review on your podcast platform of choice or iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated. It's one of the best ways you can help support us, support the show. And the other way is, we always appreciate a share on social media. That's a big deal for us. If you're able to take a quick second to do that, that would be greatly appreciated. And other than that, I think that's all the main ways to get a hold of us. But we appreciate any comments or messages. And every time we hear from someone, it always means a lot to be able to talk about what we've been discussing and hear that someone's been listening. So please do get in touch if you like. So, and I think is there anything else?
Well, I think there's really only one thing left to do, and that's to go find the myth that you're living. This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.